us pray. O Lord, grant us a daily awareness of the precious gift of life which you have given us. As members of this legislative assembly, we dedicate our lives anew to the service of our province and our country. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to request that the clerk read and receive the petition which I presented to the legislature last week on behalf of 250 residents of Mirror, calling for the application of the extended flat rate calling program to the Mirror area.
We, the undersigned, request that the Assembly direct the government to require Alberta government telephones to review procedures for assessing applications to the extended flat rate calling program from communities within a 40-mile radius of major business centres to ensure equitable treatment of these communities. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions.
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to give notice that on tomorrow, December 9th, 1987, I will be proposing to the Assembly the following. Be it resolved that Mr. Halvor Johnson be appointed a member of the Standing Committee on the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund Act.
Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Transportation Utilities.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table the Gas Alberta Operating Fund financial statement to the period March 31st, 1987, along with the supplemental report.
Introduction of special guests.
Member for Edmonton Gold Bar, followed by Edmonton Millwoods.
Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée, j'ai l'honneur de vous présenter à vous ainsi qu'aux membres de l'Assemblée les élèves de 6e année en immersion français à l'école Holyrood dans Gold Bar. Cette classe est accompagnée par leur professeur, Madame Rita de Longchamp. Ils sont assis dans la galerie publique. Je les prierai de se lever pour recevoir l'accueil chaleureux de cette assemblée.
Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce to you and to the members of the Assembly today two separate introductions, I would say. The first one I'd like to introduce is two special visitors. One is Ms. Marta Moraga, who is from Nicaragua. She's in Alberta studying English at the moment. She works for the Center for Education and Agrarian Promotion in Nicaragua and was my tour guide when I was there 3 years ago. With her is Mr. Jim Peckham, the Alberta Coordinator for Tools for Peace in Alberta. And I'd ask him to please rise and receive the warm welcome of the House. And then I also would like to introduce, Mr. Speaker, to you and to the other members of the Assembly this afternoon, 27 students from the Mill Creek School. They're accompanied today by their teacher, Colleen Lefevre. They're in the public gallery, and I'm pleased to introduce them on behalf of my colleague, the member for Edmonton Avonmore. And I'd ask them to please rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, may we welcome 28 children from King Edward School, grades 5 and 6 in the constituency of Edmonton Strathcona, and perhaps they would rise and, if they continue to be very good, receive our usual welcome.
They can only hope the members will be very good. Leader of the Government House, please.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege today on behalf of my colleague, the Honourable Neil Crawford, member for Edmonton Park Allen, to introduce from the Avalon School, grade 8, 22 students who are in the gallery with their teacher, Mr. Lopatka. I would ask that they stand and receive a warm welcome from the Assembly.
Minister of Culture and Multiculturalism.
Mr. Speaker, as everyone in Edmonton and District knows, the health of so many activities here depends on volunteers, and now it's Calgary's turn. And in the audience in the members' gallery today, I'd like to introduce to you, and through you to members of the Assembly, the chairperson of the Mayor's Office for the Canmore Athletes Village, where some 600 athletes will soon be presenting their performances to all of the world. In addition, a young woman who is a volunteer driver, and she and her husband will be adopting an Olympic parent, as so many others will. Mrs. Peggy Amad and Mrs. Kim Stewart, would they stand and receive the Assembly's welcome?
Member for Red Deer South, with a relative perhaps?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me on behalf of myself and on behalf of the member for Red Deer North to introduce a very special guest to you and through you to the members of the Legislative Assembly. As all members know, and in fact all Albertans know, the 1988 Alberta Winter Games are being held in Red Deer from January 28th to January 31st. Mr. Speaker, as you can appreciate, it's been very difficult for us in Red Deer to not overshadow the Olympics with this excellent caliber of event soon to be happening in Red Deer. And I want you to know that as a city, we didn't complain when the Prime Minister neglected to mention our name in the national advertising campaign. We only hope that the 1988 Olympics will not seem too anticlimactic once the 1988 Alberta Winter Games have concluded. Mr. Speaker, here in the members' gallery to invite all of you to the most successful Winter Games ever is our 1988 Winter Games mascot, Mickey the Beaver. I would ask the House to join me in giving Mickey the Beaver a round of applause.
This is your relic. And Red Deer North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to introduce to you two of Mickey's traveling companions, bravely traveling with Mickey and fighting off autograph seekers today, Mrs. Scotty Hull and Darlene Robotham. These two ladies represent just two of literally hundreds of volunteers who have been working already for months to make these games a success. We'd ask that the House would give them their customary warm welcome.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Mulroney government has finally admitted what every Westerner has known all along, that the West does not get its fair share of federal contracts. Mr. Speaker, the West has 30% of the population and receives less than 12% of federal government contracts, while Ontario and Quebec get 76%, Mr. Speaker. I might point out that this went down in 86, 87, and it's less than we even got during the Trudeau Liberal reign, Mr. Speaker. My question, Mr. Speaker, will the Premier tell the House whether he is aware of this situation and what this government is doing to change this unfair situation?
Mr. Speaker, if the Honourable Leader of the Opposition had been paying attention, he would know that this matter has been raised at First Ministers' conferences this year. It's been raised at the Premier's conference this year. It was raised at the Western Premier's conference. Then it has been discussed with the various federal ministers involved, plus the Prime Minister. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, we will be seeing a dramatic difference.
Mr. Speaker, talk is cheap. He doesn't seem to have much influence on his buddy Brian, Mr. Speaker. But my question is to the Premier. Has the Premier done any assessment on how the Mulroney trade deal will affect the ability of Canadian governments to direct federal procurement dollars into regional development initiatives for Western Canada? Have they any studies on this, and will the Premier tell us about it?
Mr. Speaker, again, the honourable member might know that last week we had a First Minister's Conference in which this matter was raised, regional development, and how it impacts on the free trade agreement. And the general discussion and agreement amongst the premiers was, in fact, that regional development had been specifically excluded from the trade agreement, and that we would be able to pursue all of those matters of regional development now that we had been pursuing.
Speaker, that is not the case under this agreement. There's a government procurement. It says the United States have agreed to eliminate that. My question is to this Premier, how can the Premier, is he going on Brian Mulroney's word again? It says right here that's been eliminated. Now, Mr. Speaker, I say to the Premier, how can you have it when it says it's eliminated in this agreement, Mr. Speaker?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition doesn't know what he's talking about. Because, in fact, Mr. Speaker, I chaired the premiers over the last 18 months. I know what's in the agreement, and I know that regional development is excluded from the trade agreement, and that we are able to pursue regional development as aggressively or more aggressively in the future as we have in the past.
Mr. Speaker,
that's been aggressive, eh?
we're talking about federal government contracts. It says here, and I quote, the United States and Canada have agreed to eliminate binational restrictions on procurements of covered goods, Mr. Speaker. What does that mean, Mr. Premier, if it doesn't mean that they can't do it?
That's right. The one thing it does mean that it does not impact on regional development, Mr. Speaker. And it's really remarkable that the Leader of the Opposition and his party and this Liberal group over here, who are so negative about free trade, will come day after day in here trying to put a negative outlook on something that is an incredible opportunity for the people of Alberta, great for this province, great for this country, and because they have such a lack of confidence in this province and in this country, they just can't believe that we can compete with anyone we want to compete with.
Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary question.
Mr. Speaker, I've often heard marriages don't last long in modern times, but that cooperation that they showed last night seems to have fallen apart already. Mr. Speaker.
You're on time.
Mr. Speaker, it's unusual the joy with which I'm created now that they know I'm going after the Speaker, or after the Premier. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. A Freudian slip, I'm sure. To the Premier, in point of the fact that Mr. Giz, also one that was present at your First Minister's conferences, is taking the line that indeed regional grants to the Maritimes will be affected by free trade. How can he say that regional grants to the West will not be affected, yet the premiers in Eastern Canada and the Maritimes say that regional grants to the Maritimes will be affected? Who's correct?
Mr. Speaker, in fact, regional grants to any part of the country will not be affected. That is clear. It's been confirmed by all of the premiers as well as the Prime Minister.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition. Please.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct my second question to the member from Edmonton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To average Albertans, health care is a public resource to be used to meet their physical and mental needs. But to an elite here in Alberta, as well as to many in the United States, the delivery of medical and hospital services is big business from which huge sums of money can be made. To the Premier, with respect to the right of national treatment in the service section of the Mulroney trade deal, does the Premier not agree that it is now possible for big U.S. medical businesses to come into Alberta, to set up shop, build the Alberta Healthcare Insurance Plan while they expand their businesses north of the border?
No, Mr. Speaker.
The agreement clearly states, Mr. Speaker, that they certainly can.
Didn't read that part either.
To the Premier, how about such companies as the Hospital Corporation of America, the American Medical International Incorporated, and Humana and others? Why is it that under the current trade deal they would not want to penetrate the Alberta healthcare market under the right of national treatment and the right of establishment, which is clearly in the deal and would clearly promote the Americanization of the delivery of healthcare services in Canada?
Mr. Speaker, there will not be any Americanization of healthcare services in Canada.
I teach reading.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly would table for the Assembly documents which suggest that United Medical Corporation, New Medico's Head Injury System, and the American Surgery Centers.
Please, honourable member, this is an appropriate time for tabling, so let's get on with the supplementary question, please.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, is he not aware that these companies in their documents have already stated that they are planning to develop markets in Canada for their specialized medical services, such as cardiac, brain injury, and others?
Mr. Speaker, we will always welcome people who can provide services to the people of Alberta, provided they do it under the laws of the province of Alberta.
Well, all right, thank you, Mr. Speaker, because that's precisely the point. So will the Premier then confirm that under the right of establishment in the trade deal, the right of national treatment, that therefore American medical companies have guaranteed in the trade deal that average Albertans will see their tax dollars going through the Alberta Healthcare Insurance Plan to the shareholders and the coffers of American business south of the border?
Mr. Speaker, it's another example, I guess, of the absolute negative outlook of the members in the NDP party. The socialists just can't stand something that has the word free in it, let alone free trade. And they'll try and find some way of trying to put a negative outlook on it. The point he's just been trying to make is absolute nonsense.
Member for Edmonton Goldbar.
Mr. Speaker, before this occurs, will the Premier at least undertake to the province that no further privatization of Alberta hospitals will occur so that this can be prevented?
Mr. Speaker, obviously we have been doing some experimental testing of privatization in the healthcare system, and I see no reason why that should not be continued. As a matter of fact, I should point out to all members that we just recently had an Albertan who traveled to the United States to receive some very valuable medical services.
Main question, Leader of the Liberals, followed by Leader...
Speaker, this is to the Premier too. And this proposed free trade agreement that is splitting up this recent marriage between yourself and the NDP. Could you... there is... I'd howl too, because apparently nobody wants them. But, Mr. Speaker, the Canada-U.S. trade agreement that the Premier is proposing has within it, of course, a 6-month withdrawal if the Canadians are unhappy down the road, 4 or 5 years down the road. However, this may be, we can do this with a certain amount of, or with a lack of harm, is from the bilateral trade portion and from the continental energy portion, Mr. Premier. But the unlimited, unfettered foreign investment portion, Mr. Premier, how could we buy back our country in 6 months if we decide we want to get out of this agreement?
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party immediately assumes that somehow our country is going to be bought away from us. There again is that negative outlook, that putting down of the ability of Albertans and Canadians. We don't share his negative view of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, that's a good way of getting out of the answer. I think we're well worth buying. I think we're well worth buying, and so that we got that point. But in view of the difficulties of buying one's country back, would the Premier consider asking the Mulroney government to set aside or withdraw from the unlimited foreign investment portion, to leave this trade agreement only one that covers energy and bilateral trade? Would he consider asking them to do that?
Mr. Speaker, he started off with a phony assumption, and it's completely hypothetical and certainly not something I'm going to consider.
Mr. Speaker, there are none so blind as those that will not see. Now, in it has to be repeated over there ad nauseum for it to sink in. Mr. Speaker, I was just answering a very thoughtful question by them. In view of the fact that a reported 80% of the public do not understand the impact of this particular agreement, Mr. Premier, or to the Premier, would he be think of commissioning studies on this agreement over the next while that would be releasable to the public?
That's certainly something to consider, Mr. Speaker.
Final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is to the Premier in the calm light of reasonableness, now that I've got him settled down and he's sitting in the paddock, not whistling around the track with us. Would the government also, in these reasonable submission or reasonable analyses that he will hopefully be turning over to the public of Alberta to help make up their minds, would he be also interested in inviting submissions from interested parties in helping to put this through?
Mr. Speaker, there's a great flow of information coming to the government from interested parties, and we always welcome them. I must say, Mr. Speaker, I wonder sometimes if the Liberal Party and the NDP Party here in this legislature would remember that they're representing the people of Alberta, not parties that dictate to them out of central Canada.
Representing the people of Alberta.
That's right. Here, here.
Mr. Speaker, we don't listen to Brian Mulroney all the time like this Premier does, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, I want to ask this Premier, saying he represents the people of Alberta, what will it take before he will begin to look at this deal and question whether it is good for Alberta? What evidence is it going to take for this Premier?
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, we know what's good for the people of Alberta. The one thing we know is that the strength of this province is the people of Alberta. And these people are capable of competing with anyone, and they don't need a couple of parties who are taking their orders from central Canada in here, trying to knock something that is incredible opportunity for our province. They're unable to have any positive outlook at all. They were happy when the price of oil was down. They were happy when unemployment was up. They can't.
Red Deer South. Red Deer South. Yes, sir, please. Red Deer South, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought that was Ed Broadbent and John Turner I heard flapping in the House. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Economic Development and Trade, and I always welcome the opportunity to hear some of the good news on trade. Could the Minister please advise this Assembly the effects of the Free Trade Agreement on Alberta's efforts to diversify its economy?
Honourable Minister flipping over for this reply. Brief.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta's trade with the United States is a significant part of the economic base of our province. As a matter of fact, our exports totally outside of Alberta to other parts of the world range about $14 billion annually. And about 75% of that trade is into the United States. When one translates the trade into the creation of jobs for Albertans, that export represents creation of over 200,000 jobs for Albertans. Now, with respect to the opportunities that arise from a free trade pact, I think it's obvious as a result of perusal of the C.D. Howe report, Economic Council report, the MacDonald Commission report, our own evaluation of the consequences of free trade, and the access to that United States market by Alberta business community, and the consequences in terms of creating jobs are difficult to quantify, but they are very, very positive. And they're positive in electrical products, they're positive in petrochemicals, positive in processed food products, positive in a whole range of manufactured products, oil and gas equipment, the service industry, that creates a myriad of opportunities for Alberta business. So in terms of what the impact of the free trade is, it's really up to Albertans to achieve the benefits, and they are and can be huge.
Thank you. Leader of the Representative.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Agriculture. I hate to move away from the gymnastics that are going on, but I would like to ask a question that relates more to southern Alberta than all of Canada. It's with regards to the Sugar Beet Stabilization Fund and what may constitute what is considered cash costs in the calculation of the proposed payout. The original figure in that program under the agreement of April 1987 was $48.57 per standard ton. And I understand under the calculations that are going on now that has been revised to some $37.95 per standard ton. And my question to the Minister in terms of this concern is, what is the government of Alberta's position with regards to that payout, and has a directive gone from the Minister to the representative on the committee that represents the government?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to report to the Honourable Member for Little Bow the same response I gave to the Honourable Member for Tabor-Warner on Friday, when I indicated to him that we have instructed our officials who are working on the Agricultural Stabilization Board to exercise greater flexibility when relating to those cash costs that the Honourable Member has just referred to. When we were in Ottawa recently and met with the Minister responsible, who has been very instrumental, the Honourable Charles Mayer, he asked if we would be flexible to the cash costs as he would be. We indicated our acceptance of that proposal. Unfortunately, I have to share with the Honourable Member, the province of Manitoba is the hindrance to that flexibility, whereby they've indicated their unwillingness to cooperate with the other two parties concerned.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, I understand the sugar beet growers of Manitoba are willing to cooperate. The items that are of concern in terms of the payout, as I understand it, are cash payments on rented land, interest paid on land, interest paid on machinery, labor costs, which I feel are costs in terms of a farmer planting that crop and taking it off. Could the Minister indicate the government's position with regards to those direct costs? Would they be included in the calculation of the payout or not in terms of the Alberta government's policy?
Let me respond firstly to the first proposition brought forward by the Honourable Member for Little Bow as it related to the producers in Manitoba, and to concur with what he indicated, whereby the producers themselves have indicated an acceptance of altering the relationship as it deals with cash costs, as we have. I can only underscore what I indicated earlier to the Honourable Member, that we are willing to exhibit a willingness to operate or to exercise greater flexibility as it relates to specific cash crops or cash costs, as he has just indicated.
Mr. Speaker, clarification from the Minister. Does that flexibility that the Minister is talking about, does that mean a lower cash payout? Is that what the Minister is indicating? Or is the flexibility to bring about a higher cash payout to the sugar beet farmers of southern Alberta?
Our flexibility relates to a higher cash payout.
Final supplementary then, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister then support the payout of $48.57 per standard ton, as was agreed to in April of 1987?
Mr. Speaker, that is a figure that the sugar beet producers themselves had indicated, taking into account their calculations. We accepted that figure and their calculations, but when we went through the process of examining them, we found some errors in their calculations. Acknowledging those errors, so we have indicated a greater acceptance to have greater flexibility in the specific cash costs.
Supplementary, Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, back to the broader issue of the payout to the farmers. In view of the statement, Mr. Speaker, by the National Transport Minister, John Crosby, that there will be no change in the freight payout to farmers until next election, how can this minister possibly justify to this House the extension for another 6 months for the employment of Mr. Planche, a former minister, to do nothing?
Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to respond to the honourable member for Westlock Sturgeon. He is wrong on 2 counts. One, Mr. Crosby has indicated a desire to work with us, and I'm going to ask the Honourable Minister of Economic Development to supplement it, because the 2 of us have worked very closely on it. Secondly, as it relates to the contract, the Honourable Minister too does have some good news. But thirdly, let me indicate a willingness has been exhibited by the main grain organization within the province of Alberta, whereby the Alberta Wheat Pool just recently accepted a proposal put forward by myself at their annual meeting to open a dialogue with us to examine the various mechanisms as it relates to the method of payment of the Crow benefit.
Perhaps the area might come up under another line of questioning. The chair recognizes Redwater Andrew, followed by Vegreville, then Edmonton Gold Bar, Olds Didsbury, Calgary Mountain View, Wainwright, Edmonton Strathcona, Drumheller, and all points south, east, and west.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today, Mr. Speaker, is to the Minister of Public Works, Supply and Services. Mr. Speaker, I've had many calls and concerns from my constituency that saying that since we're in a time of physical restraint, could the minister tell the Assembly how he can justify hauling in $100,000 worth of snow onto the legislative grounds?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me assure the members of the Assembly that there was no $100,000 worth of snow hauled into the legislative grounds. Secondly, let me clarify also that there's no truth to the rumor that we hauled it from Nakiska, where, by the way, there is 70 centimeters of good solid base and 5 centimeters of freshly fallen snow. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, what we're talking about here is 2 truckloads of ice shavings off Confederation Arena, which was transported to the legislative grounds by the same equipment and the same staff that normally at this time of the year is working overtime to transport snow in the other direction. I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't compliment our grounds people on putting a little bit extra into getting ready for the spirit of Christmas by covering up the bases of those trees and providing some enjoyment for a number of the children that were here for the opening festivities. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, and I see you're getting impatient, I never cease to be amazed that some of the flakes in the opposition would try to distort such a simple activity.
Red snow, Andrew.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Since the snowflakes are falling of the divorce yesterday on the other side, I've got a question to the Premier here. Mr. Speaker, how many people did attend the Legislative Assembly grounds on Sunday afternoon to celebrate the start of the festive season?
Mr. Speaker, it was a very fine ceremony, and I appreciated the input from other members of the House. And, of course, Mr. Speaker, to you, sir, who managed that ceremony in such an appropriate way. My understanding, there was something in excess of 2,000 people here, and I think they not only enjoyed Sunday, but many Albertans will be coming back to enjoy the legislature during this Christmas period, and if they get comfortable with being at the legislature during Christmas, perhaps they will spend other times here as well. I only say, Mr. Speaker, that it would be interesting that when there were 2,000 here, that if it had been a march, someone would have estimated at 10,000. Because it was 2,000 and it was a very positive thing, I think they estimated at 400.
Supplementary, Westlock Sturgeon.
Very quick supplementary to the minister. Mr. Speaker, you'd appreciate this coming from the country that we both have. Trees are very hard to come by. And I would like to know who authorized cutting down and moving into the center of the water fountain that beautiful big spruce tree that took at least 75 years to grow. Who authorized that desecration of our nature?
Mr. Speaker, not being a Scrooge, I will take responsibility for that.
Well, Chair recognize. Oh, couldn't. Vegreville, followed by Edmonton Gold-Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Albertans were led to believe that the Mulrooney trade deal would be good for Alberta farmers because, in spite of the damage it will do to egg producers and dairy producers, grain producers, and poultry producers, it would at least assure our red meat producers guaranteed access to the U.S. market. It's clear, Mr. Speaker, that we do not and we will not have guaranteed access. In fact, the Minister of Agriculture was reduced yesterday to talking about some sort of hope for increased access. And my question to the Minister, does the Minister not recognize that allowing imports of U.S. eggs to double will undermine the operations of the egg marketing agencies and hurt Alberta egg producers as a result?
Mr. Speaker, recognizing the season that we're in, I'm going to do my level best to be very congenial to the honourable member, even though he does pursue in leaving misperceptions amongst the population. We had it prior to the initialing of the agreement. He was complaining that we were going to do away with these supply-managed sectors such as the feather and dairy industries. Now he's coming back with his fictitious figures as it relates to those sectors. They have been protected. As the honourable member is aware, we are going to go on the last 5-year average as it relates to imports into Canada from the U.S., which is going to have a very minimal impact in most of these areas. Some areas it's not going to affect at all. Others it's going to affect as much as 1%. But again, Mr. Speaker, as we indicated prior to the initialing of this agreement, the supply-managed sectors have been protected. There's also provisions within the agreement whereby we can have additional sectors in the event that we so desire to have so.
Well, again, we're dealing with facts and we're dealing with sectors in the agreement here. Does the Minister not recognize that encouraging increased imports of U.S. ice cream and yogurt will undermine the effective operation of the Canadian Dairy Commission and hurt Alberta dairy farmers as a result? Do you not recognize that?
No.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member should be aware that there isn't going to be any increased imports as it relates to dairy products under this agreement. There is a marginal increase in the feather industry, but none whatsoever as it relates to the dairy industry, Mr. Speaker. And I'm surprised that the honourable member would sink to the depths of distorting those facts.
Better read it, Peter.
There's a removal of tariffs, and the Minister ought not to be so naive as to think that that will not lead to an increase of imports.
That's right.
Will the Minister then, in his gracious Christmas-like way, assure the House that he will seek to have U.S. yogurt and ice cream placed on the import control list so that prominent Conservatives like Peter Plockington and his company Palm Dairies will not get what they want out of this deal, and that is cheap milk at the expense of Alberta dairy producers?
Right.
Mr. Speaker, we have in place in Alberta and in Canada a very effective mechanism as it relates to the management and supply of our dairy industry. It's a mechanism that we just recently strengthened by way of amendments in the spring session of this legislature, of which the honourable member supported. We're going to continue with our strong support of the dairy industry, recognizing the important facet it does play in our Alberta way of life.
Stars and stripes forever.
Christmas season and the time for fairy tales, Mr. Speaker. Now, my next question is the Premier. I know that the Premier will likely support the detailed agreement because, without question, because Brian Mulrooney tells him that it's a good thing. But I wonder if the Premier would would be willing to reassess his support of the Mulrooney trade deal, because it clearly does not guarantee red meat producers assured access to the American market, and it does guarantee that a lot of other Alberta farmers will be hurt as a result.
Mr. Speaker, again, it seems to be an epidemic over there of negative thinking. The farmers of Alberta, the farm organizations of Alberta, are pleased with this breath of fresh air, which allows them to expand their markets on an assured basis into the largest trading nation in the world. The farmers of Alberta can compete with anybody, and they're going to prove it under this trade agreement, and they won't be running around with their heads between their legs like the NDP.
Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, this is supplemental to the Premier and ties into the farmers accessing the American markets. I was wondering and trying to bring some light in between the two fountains of truth that have been squirting at each other here, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Premier, has there been any studies made on because of the free flow of capital and the possible rise in the Canadian dollar? In other words, if it goes to par with the American dollar, thereby cutting our farm advantage in shipping into the U.S. Have you made any studies there as to the flow of capital, bringing our dollar up, and what that would do to farmers trying to export in the U.S.?
Mr. Speaker, now he's at it. Now he's trying to grasp one more thing that he can possibly try and put a negative outlook on this agreement. Now he's starting to tell you that the Canadian dollar is going to go way up and hurt our farmers. I have never seen a bunch so negative in my life. They enjoy bad times. They loved unemployment. They loved the low energy prices. They like it when agriculture isn't doing well. They love it if they think the free trade agreement wouldn't work. In fact, they live in negativity. But we're believing positive things, Mr.
Calgary McCall, supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, if the clowns next to me here would keep quiet, they might learn something too. Mr. Speaker, considering to the Premier, considering the fact that not only the free trade agreement is one that will not only benefit Albertans but Canadians, and considering that the same people who were opposed initially to the agreement with regards to the Auto Pact, is it not a matter of posturing, and that, in fact, to the Premier, would he not agree that the same emphasis should be given to the free trade agreement that was given to the Auto Pact at that time, and that people should see what they're seeing presently as the negativity that is broadcast by these clowns next door here?
Members are properly pointed out, it is a long way from agriculture. Edmonton Gold Bar, followed by Old Didsbury, Calgary Mountain View.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I do have something positive to suggest. My questions are to the Minister of Social Services. Mr. Speaker, Albertans have been waiting and listening and hoping for some action by the government to improve the glaring inadequacy of daycare standards. In spite of repeated efforts, the only response that we've heard to date is that the Honourable Minister of Social Services is waiting for the release of the federal government's report on childcare. Well, we've now seen the report, and it doesn't address the requirements for standards. Time has now run out for the Department of Social Services. To the Minister, will the Minister now acknowledge that what is most needed in Alberta is not just dollars, but a set of meaningful standards for trained child care workers?
Mr. Speaker, the preface to the honourable member's question dealt with, I think, one party or maybe two party opposite their desire to see the federal government walk into provincial responsibility with respect to daycare standards. I think that most Albertans would find that offensive. I believe Alberta parents have the capacity to speak to the care of their children, as well as anybody out of Ottawa speaking to that area. And in that vein, Mr. Speaker, it is certainly my desire now, with the information available, firstly about the cost sharing that will be made available to Alberta, and secondly, the tax area that will speak to parents who do not access institutionalized childcare. We believe we have an opportunity to enhance standards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That must be comforting to the thousands of parents and children who know the government's still reviewing something when the solutions are already known at hand. Will the minister then tell the Assembly exactly when the daycare standards are going to be changed and improved?
Mr. Speaker, it is interesting to note that last week in my trip to Ottawa, discussing this matter with ministers from other provinces, their comments are that it is our hope that in 7 to 10 years from now, that we will have the same accessibility to childcare as the people of Alberta enjoy. I think, and to speak to child staff ratios, physical surroundings, program requirements are as fine in Alberta as they are anywhere in Canada. The one area that the honourable member insists on speaking about as, in a general term, as standards, as if we don't have standards, speaks to the academic education that the caregivers may or may not have. And Mr. Speaker, I have indicated before that that area is under review. It is our belief that a person coming into the childcare field who indeed cares about children first and foremost, their opportunity to care for children and their ability to do that job would be enhanced by a number of skills that are provided in various institutions in this province.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I am talking about training standards, and access, I might add, does not ensure quality. Mr. Speaker, has the minister negotiated with post-secondary institutions to ensure that spaces and training programs are sufficient to train and retrain childcare workers so that it becomes the norm in our province and not the minority, as is now the case?
Mr. Speaker, the ability of individuals to access training opportunities is certainly an area that all of us and the government have been interested in, particularly in rural Alberta, because this is in a number of occasions where questions have arose. I am certainly confident that the post-secondary institutions and others who would provide opportunity for daycare training will speak to that when the Alberta government has announced just what the requirements will be.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister take steps to ensure that provisions are in place for the establishment of parent and community boards for both profit and non-profit centres, so that the onus of monitoring doesn't rest with the already overworked inspectors who must deal only with the owners?
Mr. Speaker, I think that monitoring is a very important part of the daycare system, not only to ensure that children are being appropriately cared for, but that standards are being met and that there is a fiscal responsibility in the system. And Mr. Speaker, the honourable member has chosen to ignore the Social Care Facilities Review Committee, a committee of citizens that I believe last year would have visited some 600 daycares in the province and also brings good information on the daycare system.
Clover Bar, followed by...
Has the Minister or the Department initiated any studies with the Department and the private sector to have the children on, say, a plant site, so that the children are in a daycare facility right at the plant site so the mother and child can have time together, like, say, over the lunch hour? Have any studies been done in Alberta to facilitate that?
Mr. Speaker, there is certainly information available from other jurisdictions with respect to daycare sightings in conjunction with the workplace. We have had a freeze on spaces in childcare in this province, with the exception of areas where there has been proven to be a deficit in terms of addressing the spaces that are needed. we have lifted that freeze for several on-site daycares. And it is my hope that monitoring those situations will provide us with an opportunity to understand whether children will be served. After all, we are speaking to wanting good care for our children and not just convenience for parents. We'll have an opportunity to see if parents indeed access the availability of their children at close hand so that the care will be enhanced.
Supplementary, Calgary-Milliken, followed by Edmonton-Calder.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question on the matter of improved standards. If I understood the question correctly, when are the standards going to be improved? Has the minister received any of the letters from the people who have been writing me and phoning me expressing the concerns over if we raise the standards much higher that they cannot afford to use daycare facilities in this province?
Good point.
Mr. Speaker, that is always a concern. Questions are raised about the salaries of individuals working in the child care system, and it is a most important role that they play.
Order, please, in the whole House. Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't sure whether I should continue or wait for the wisdom from the Honourable Member for Edmonton-Belmont, but now that I have the opportunity, I would say that it is important for parents to make the judgment as to whether it is best for them to enter the workplace with the attendant costs of childcare, or whether it is in the best interest of the child and their own budget to stay home with their children.
Edmonton-Calder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister. Currently, accountability is practically nil on the part of daycare centres. When will the Minister require financial and management audits and also tie the money given to daycare centres to quality of care?
Mr. Speaker, there is an ongoing review in terms of the administration area, and we have made some changes in that regard, and other changes that may be considered significant wouldn't be done until all of the policy decisions are announced. Mr. Speaker, there's a great deal of discussion in this House, and it is appropriate with respect to the institutionalized childcare. It is certainly my hope that Albertans would also pay as much attention to the parents who struggle very hard to look after their children at home, and it is important for us as a government not to have disincentives in place for those parents who wish to raise their own children.
Member for Olds Didsby, followed by Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions also are to the Minister of Social Services, and they also deal with the announcement last week by the Federal Health and Welfare Minister, Jay Kepps. His announcement appears to provide a financial bonus for this province, and I would ask the Minister of Social Services to provide to the House her analysis of the financial aspects of this new initiative.
Mr. Speaker, the federal government has gone some distance to rectify inequities that had existed with respect to the daycare systems across Canada, in that those of us who had parents supporting private sector daycare centres were not receiving, the governments were not receiving cost sharing on behalf of those parents. The federal government indeed has answered our request to look closely at that and will have complete cost sharing in that area. But I would caution the honourable member in an assumption that there is some sort of windfall for the province because with respect to particularly the additional deductions that will be allowed for child care, there could be an impact on I guess you'd call it foregone revenue that the provincial treasurer might address, and the net returns to Alberta at this point are unknown, but I know that the provincial treasurer is looking at all the figures and going to provide us with that information.
Time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions together with some additional information to be supplied to the House with regard to an earlier series of questions on this day by the Minister of Public Works, Supply and Services? Opposed? Carried. Olds, Didsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The National Daycare Strategy emphasizes for most of Canada a priority on the development of daycare spaces, yet in Alberta, we currently have an 18% vacancy rate. Could the Minister advise whether this statistic means that Alberta will not be able to take advantage of the provisions of the strategy which call for capital cost sharing of non-profit daycares?
Mr. Speaker, the federal government has put in place, I believe, a system of capital grants that will enhance the opportunity for public sector daycare, those communities and organizations that wish to develop their own. This will give them an extra leg up, if you will, to develop that, although 25% of the funding has to be found elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, not all communities in the province that may wish institutionalized child care at this point in time have it. That may provide an opportunity for the honourable member's information, because certainly he also represents a rural constituency for the rural areas to particularly benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister explain, in light of the questions earlier, just how she will proceed in addressing the important issue of increasing standards for child care in this province, when the provision for federal funds appears to be designated for operating and capital costs of formal daycare?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that our ability to enhance standards in the child care area are tied to the federal government grants. Certainly, we are in a position now, if there is a net benefit, to see the opportunities in fact enhanced. The area, for instance, there is, I believe, a $100 million fund that is one that can be accessed for special opportunities, innovative projects. Indeed, I believe that the federal minister mentioned training, and it may be, Mr. Speaker, that that can be utilized in Alberta to enhance the opportunities for our caregivers.
Supplementary. All right. Supplementary. Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the establishment of that research grant for child care, has the government applied for any research monies to examine the benefits of profit versus non-profit child care centres?
Mr. Speaker, that's an important question, because certainly we have a number of things in Alberta that we believed were appropriate to address, and yet research in every single jurisdiction seems to be a waste. It's a duplication. In that vein, because I chair the ministers this particular year that speak to this area, I asked them to have lunch with me on Thursday last in Ottawa, and we did address a number of components that we believe should have a concerted and cooperative effort so that each jurisdiction wasn't duplicating, for instance, the research area. That is one that we looked at. The honourable member mentioned research that might weigh public and private sector childcare. I think that if one were to visit hundreds of centres in this province, as some people have, they would find good and poor and maybe excellent that run through all of those centres, regardless of which particular whether it's public or private daycare. I think it's important for us to make sure that they all provide very excellent care. And Mr. Speaker, it would be my hope also, given that we've had a history in the North American continent of some 20 years of institutionalized child care, that one might also address the effects of institutionalized child care on our children.
Supplementary. Edmonton Calder.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. What is the Minister prepared to do about those parents who choose to stay at home but who are too poor to pay any income tax and therefore will not benefit from the federal government's tax deduction proposal?
Mr. Speaker, that area was addressed in the federal policy through tax credits, which is certainly turns out to be for lower income parents a direct payment. I believe at present the tax credit for families is some $484. The federal government intends to increase that to $584 next year and then to $684 the following year. I believe if the honourable member would do some calculations on the average income that is apparent to families in the age group and that have children in the age group that would utilize childcare, the honourable member would find that the tax credits are very nearly equal to the opportunities provided to families who have tax deductions.
Minister of Public Works, Supply and Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In responding to the member for Redwater Andrew earlier, there was one piece of pertinent information I did not provide to the House. Mr. Speaker, the only direct cost to provide the 2 truckloads of ice shavings was the cost of fuel for the equipment, estimated value $40. I repeat, Mr. Speaker, $40 whole dollars.
Orders of the day.